come to the open.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. An important part of the Johnson Center's mission is to study the impact of economic freedom on our lives and society. And given how important economic freedom is to make our lives richer and happier, it's very important to help understand what factors affect the expansion or contraction of economic freedom in our society. The United States has fallen in the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of the World rankings from 2nd in 2000 to 16th in 2011. And this is going to affect our standard of living in the future. To talk about a project that two of my colleagues and I have embarked on to explore some of the political dynamics of economic freedom are my colleagues from the Johnson Center, Dr. John Dove and Dr. George Crowley. Gentlemen, welcome back to the show.
Thanks.
What we've been working on is something known as an economic freedom vote index for looking at congressional votes. But before we get into our index and what we've been working on, I thought we want to start by talking a little bit about economic freedom generally and the indices of economic freedom. So what do we mean by economic freedom?
So generally, economic freedom is when that term is used, we're talking about the degree to which economies or societies depend on market allocation of resources and private decision making, as opposed to centralized government involvement in the economy.
Certainly economists, at least back to the day of Adam Smith, have been talking about the importance of a market economy. So in one sense, the emphasis on the market or the market economy isn't anything new, but we do have something new in the development of more than one different index of economic freedom. So what role does these indices of economic freedom play in our analysis here?
Well, yeah, these indices give us an idea of where it is that economic freedom actually is around the world for different countries. How much or how little economic freedom there is, how much or how little government involvement there is. Again, because the really important aspect of this is to understand that really what we're trying to do with economic freedom is to increase the gains from trade, increase the opportunities for individuals to trade with one another, and really through that sort of strive to increase entrepreneurial activity, which overall, what we see in the Economic Freedom Index is that as that increases, it also increases wealth and well-being.
And I would just add that the purpose of the index, or these various indices, is to actually try to get at a quantifiable measure of this. Because as you mentioned, basically since the dawn of economics as a social science, we've realized that these institutions play a vital role. But it's been much more difficult to actually quantify things like the legal environment. So what these indexes try to do is using a variety of different measures, try to put a number that allows us to basically use these in statistical research.
Yeah, so that gets into our use here in statistical research. And talk a little bit about when we do our research, when we do like our statistical research, how it is that an index like this ends up being so important, and why it is we're trying to you do this statistical research. What are we trying to accomplish here in terms of specifying this relationship between economic markets and prosperity?
Yeah, well, again, I'm thinking about that. We understand the importance of economic freedom and how it is that it leads to increases in wealth and well-being. But really, the question that we need to ask or be able to understand as economists, as scientists, is, well, how much? And that's really what it is that many of these indices allow us to pinpoint, is how much do these things actually matter when it comes to things like increasing per capita GDP, like you have here, where we see that obviously countries with lower economic freedom have significantly lower per capita incomes relative to those with much more economic freedom.
And therefore, then furthermore, with an index like this, we can do further statistical analysis to try to see if there would be other factors that might be helping to explain these differences in GDP per capita across these nations. So we're trying to better nail down the causality here, right?
Absolutely, and what an index like this does, or an index like the one we're going to discuss, what it allows us to do is basically control for those institutional type factors that before we had quantifiable ways of measuring these things, were largely assumed to either not matter or be irrelevant, or we just assumed we weren't able to actually measure them. A good way to kind of think about it is if you've ever, you or when you were a child, or if you had a kid that did like a science fair experiment, you're supposed to control for all of the various variables. This was an important variable that had been up until the advent of these various measures that had largely been ignored, and these indexes allow us to basically get at that, or at least control for it, so we can see if there are other factors that actually matter. And
this helps us come up with, both as researchers to better identify what are the causes of differences in prosperity, but also then tell a more convincing story because we've been able to better quantify or control for the level of economic freedom, right?
Right, absolutely.
That's exactly right.
We're also interested in studies like the Economic Freedom Index has been used in dozens of studies to better specify the fact that yes, indeed, freer nations have higher levels of prosperity and they grow faster. And so therefore the next question that comes to mind is, well, what is it that allows some nations to be more free than others? Or if we want to try to increase economic freedom or reverse the recent declines that we've had in economic freedom in the United States, we have to start looking at the political questions of what's driving this level of economic freedom. And that's where something like a vote index comes into play, right?
Yeah, exactly. When you can actually sit there and see, because again, at the end of the day, what is really going to drive the level of economic freedom that we see is the level of involvement that we see with the government, in the sense of, is it doing things like promoting and protecting property rights, which are those positive things that we want from a government that then allows individuals to go out and increase those gains from trade, increase opportunities to trade with each other and better themselves and everyone else? Or are they doing things like hindering those opportunities, making it more difficult for people to start a business, for entrepreneurs to go out and capitalize on these opportunities?
And so certainly a place to start on the political dimension would be, in the case of for the United States, to start with Congress, because most laws that the laws that are going to either increase or decrease economic freedom have to get passed by Congress. Of course, it's a whole other question about whether when people are in Congress are voting, whether they're representing their constituents' interests or other interests. But to at least start with, we need to take a look at what Congress is doing and how Congress is voting on different measures. Now, we're interested in trying to come up with the economic freedom vote index, but there are actually a lot of other vote indices that have been put together by different groups over the years. So what we're doing here, in one sense, isn't completely new. So what are some of the other vote indices that are out there, and how have they been used in some of our public choice research?
Sure. So there's a variety. Several groups come up with these different vote indices. So the Chamber of Commerce has an index. There's an index that tries to look at congressional ideology that's called the Denominate Index, that all try to get at very specific ideas. We try to do something slightly different here, but they all are trying to do something fundamentally of capturing the role played by congressional ideology, usually defined on some very specific margin. Looking at the role that plays in various policy choices.
So if I could add to that just a little bit too. So you get things like the Americans for Democratic Action. They have an ideological score where they look at just a subset of votes that they find to be important to things like liberal causes, progressive causes, and come up with an actual score of, well, how well or how closely did congressmen and congresswomen align to sort of this ideological view, along with again, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce also has one which looks specifically at, well, how pro or anti-business are you, based on how they actually view these concepts.
Now, if there is you mentioned the Chamber of Commerce score, so if there is already a group out there, like the Chamber of Commerce, that's tracking votes affecting the climate for business in the economy, is there anything that our index might be able to add relative to these other indices, in particular, like say the Chamber of Commerce's index?
Yeah, I mean, somewhat obviously, we undertook the project, so we felt that there was a gap in that literature. I mean, one thing that needs to be kind of specified at the outset is we're looking at something fundamentally different. We're looking at economic freedom as it's usually defined in some of these other, the Fraser Institute indexes, for instance. One vote that comes to mind was the Chamber of Commerce Index actually favorably scores some votes on the Export Bank, whereas that's been fairly established as not promoting economic freedom. So we tried to look at at individual votes that very specifically and obviously affected economic freedom in either the positive or negative direction. So we're looking at a fundamentally different question.
Right, and to add to that too, it's really trying to think about something like that. We're not really looking at, pro or anti-business. It's more pro, anti-market, and market transactions and opportunities for individuals to capitalize on those opportunities.
So crony capitalist type measures that would be favors for particular businesses are anti-economic freedom. So we want to just make sure that we have an index that starts from the ground up and says, let's score everything consistent with economic freedom, right?
That's exactly right, and that's what we're trying to tease out. Yep, exactly.
Now, to go ahead and conduct this, create this vote index, we've collaborated with the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech, and so this has been a joint project between the Johnson Center and the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech. And I also provide that there's funding for this has been coming from the Templeton Foundation, a grant that they gave to the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech. And as part of a grant that's supposed to help understand the determinants of economic freedom, both in the United States and across the globe. So it's part of a larger project. And it's something that we think is going to, because, as we mentioned, that none of the other vote indices basically start from the presumption of economic freedom and attempt to follow that specifically. We think that's our contribution here, and so we'll see what we've done. So talk a little bit about how we went about constructing this index. What years were we looking at, and did we look at the House or the Senate, or exactly?
So we were able to gather roll call vote data from both the Senate and the House at the U.S. Congress for the years 2011 and 2012. Basically gathered all of the roll call votes, which are exactly what they sound like. They're the votes that we have a record of each senator or representative, the way they voted, yea or nay. From that, we went through and basically pulled out all of the straight procedural type votes where there's a call for a quorum and things along, or confirmation of various positions. And we were able to narrow it down to just the specific votes that would impact directly economic freedom. We took out the votes that were fairly convoluted and it was unclear or ambiguous to the extent that they would modify it, or perhaps it was just unclear. And we were able to kind of narrow it down to these, a subset of the votes. I think it's roughly 12% or so of the roll call votes, where it was very obvious the direction that these things would have on economic freedom.
So what were some of the reasons that we might want to have left a vote out? I mean, in some cases, there was a bill that had a lot of different effects on economic freedom, right?
Right, yeah, and that's one of the biggest reasons, was simply because obviously bills over time have become larger and larger. You can think of recent healthcare legislation, Dodd-Frank, all of that. It's many of those issues. It's actually difficult to tease out exactly which direction it would impact economic freedom, simply because there are so many things involved, or which specific component, even if it is understood that it would have one direction, it would impact in one direction, what specific issue would it be? Things like, is it going to grow the size of government? Does it impact taxation? Does it impact regulation? These are all very important factors that you also need to be able to tease out, that many times bills impact several of those categories.
Now, if we look at the economic freedom vote, or the economic freedom index of the world, because that provides our model that we were following along here. And over the period that we were looking at, 2000 votes or legislation that would have passed Congress in the years 2011 and 2012, we wanted to also make sure we took a look at what happened to the U.S.'s economic freedom ranking during those years. And we have this displayed here in this chart, and I think then it also breaks it down through across the different components of the economic freedom score, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, this is showing that over that time period, relatively flat in most of the areas. I mean, as you mentioned at kind of the top of the show, over the past decade or so, we've seen a precipitous fall as far as the United States' economic freedom score, or ranking, at least relative to other nations. Here again, it's a good illustration of the various areas as far as the size of government, things like labor market regulation, some of the things we look at with our vote score.
And I think just to point out that the rankings here for economic freedom can go up to a maximum of 10.
Sure.
So it's just seeing what they're out of. And I think most of the decline in the U.S.'s economic freedom score and rank had occurred by 2010. So although there was a decline over the decade, most of it had occurred by the time we were looking, especially 2008, 2009, I think was when a lot of that decline occurred.
Yeah, those were the major declines. And now we see more of a stabilizing effect, at least at this point.
Because it's worth mentioning that a lot of those declines were in the regulatory type environment in the immediate aftermath of the recession.
Right. Now, so we identified about 12% of the votes that Congress undertook in those years that seemed to be clearly related to economic freedom, either enhancing economic freedom or reducing economic freedom. So how did we go from there to create a vote index?
Basically, we went through and for these votes that it was fairly obvious to us the direction they would have on economic freedom. Votes where the passage of the legislation would have improved or a vote would have improved economic freedom were scored with a +1, and votes that would have had a negative or detrimental effect on economic freedom were scored with a -1. And we went through and basically assigned these types of scores to each vote for each member of both houses of Congress. And then we're able to basically compute an average for every member of the legislature.
So that score is going to range somewhere between -1 and 1.
Exactly.
Based on how, if they voted in support of economic freedom on every one of these votes, they would have a score of 1, right?
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
And if they voted against economic freedom each and every time, they'd have a score of -1.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's see what we found here in terms of some of the totals, the averages across here. I think this was looking at the average score across the two chambers. So we calculated scores for each senator and each member of the House, right? And then we have the averages, and this table, what we have is showing like the averages for the overall chambers. And then we also wanted to investigate a little bit about some of these different components of economic freedom, just to see if we had the same story going on for each of these different components or not, right?
Right, and that's an important thing too to point out, is along with an overall economic freedom score for members of Congress, we also looked at the subcomponents. That what we tried to do is compare it or organize it as well as we could based on the subcomponents of the economic freedom score. So things like, did this vote impact the size of government, regulation, business regulation, taxation, labor market freedom. We also added some additional ones thinking about federalism and education as well. And so what we see is that really overall between the two chambers, at least the overall index, it's fairly consistent, right around 0. Just there's not too much of an impact either way, which I think has some merit and provides some understanding of what's going on, and makes sense. I'm not sure what exactly the best component score is. But
so then what we did here is across the different various of our subcomponent indices, trying to look at what was the averages on each of those different components, and so what was the lowest average in the Senate, and also the House, and then the highest average across any of those components. So they're not the same component in the two different chambers,
Sure.
but just to get some sense of the fact that, although on average, the Senate, when you look at all the Senate votes, they averaged out to about 0. There was some difference in terms of support for economic freedom across the different areas, right?
Right, that's exactly right.
And in fact, for the one component there in the House, I mean, you had like half of the votes. I guess it was more than half the votes. It was closer to about 3/4 of all the votes were being cast favorably for economic freedom to get that average up over 0.5 in that case, right?
Exactly.
And so just trying to show that although we're interested in economic freedom in the aggregate, that's an aggregate, right? And economic freedom comes from all of these different types of policies. And if we really want to understand what's driving economic freedom, we have to make sure we're looking at whether it be spending or taxation or regulation, and different things could be driving those dynamics in those different areas, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something it's very important to kind of realize, is that this is a big kind of aggregation of institutions, as kind of properly understood, is a variety of different types of policies. So the kind of typical breakdown of economic freedom, at least in the index that we're most familiar with, is things like the size of government, just how large the government is, but also how much its presence is felt in taxation and things like the regulatory environment. You can imagine scenarios where a government perhaps doesn't have as large a tax burden or as large a presence in spending, but is extremely regulatory and is still that's still a market that is not actually terribly free, even though the government's presence may not be as large.
Then we also want to break down the scores by party, looking at Republicans versus Democrats. And I think in each of these cases, the average, when you took the average across all of the Republican members of the House or all the Republican members of the Senate and compared them to the Democratic members of each chamber, the average for the Republicans was higher, both in total and on each component. But in this figure, what it did was to took the difference between the Republicans' average score and the Democrats' average score. And on these different areas. And so what we certainly see here is that on average, yes, the Republicans were voting more in favor of economic freedom. There is some differences in terms of how close or how different, I guess, divergent the parties are on these different issues, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just looking at this graphic here, you can see that there are certainly areas where the parties, the difference between the parties is much larger. I mean, it stands to reason just in how we defined economic freedom that, as you mentioned, the Republicans would perhaps score more frequently on the positive side of that, just by virtue of the fact that what we're trying to measure here. But you're right. I mean, there are some very telling differences as far as the degree to which the parties basically differ on some of these different components here.
Certainly on taxation in the Senate, I mean, the Republicans and Democrats are it's hard to distinguish them. They were voting very similarly.
Right.
At least, again, based on the set of bills that we included and that were voted on during that, I guess, those 2 years in the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we can also look at some scores for individual members of Congress. And although this is a common thing that different interest groups, like Americans for Democratic Actions, why they compile their vote indices, we weren't particularly interested in scoring individual members of the House or the Senate, but we can do that. And so it's sort of interesting to take a look and see which members of both the House and the Senate turned out to have the best, or I guess not the best, but the vote records that would most closely align with economic freedom, and then the ones that were most consistently voting against the economic freedom position. So what do we see here?
Sorry, I can't. I mean,
it's useful in addition to the fact that people like lists, they like to be able to compare. It's also a useful check on our index. So to make sure we're essentially measuring what we're trying to measure. So at the top of the list here in the Senate, anyway, we have Rand Paul, who's somebody who is very vocal on a lot of these issues, as being a big proponent of at least on the economic freedom side, a big proponent of that, and he scores near the highest. And you'll see. Even to the extent that it's along party lines, to the extent that Republicans would be more in favor of the types of things that kind of foster economic freedom. When you look at the kind of opposite end of the spectrum, we see a very similar thing that we have. I believe it's Bernie Sanders who ends up, or is he not? I thought that he
didn't quite make the top five.
Okay. Well, you see people that are along the again kind of the ideological line where, and to be perfectly fair, this is not something that they would necessarily disagree with.
Right.
These are the types of policies that they are kind of adamantly opposed to for various reasons. So again, it's just kind of a useful, in addition to just kind of be fun to see where people score, it's a useful check to make sure that our index is actually scoring along the lines that we were hoping to when we designed it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I think I think from our standpoint in doing this index, we wanted to really make sure that we were getting at what we were actually trying to get at, and sort of corresponded. Mm-hmm. And then we can also break down the scores by combining the House delegations plus the senators, we can come up with a score for each state. And here's the state scores ranked. Again, if they've got a negative number, that means they're preponderance or an average votes against the economic freedom position. So which are the best states here, at least in terms of voting in line with economic freedom?
Right, obviously we see Idaho and Utah, Kansas, and then we see Alabama's 9th. So Alabama actually fares particularly well, not at the absolute top, but not particularly poorly either. So still some things that state delegation can improve on in both the House and the Senate. And obviously Hawaii and Connecticut, many of those East Coast states score relatively poorly. And again, that sort of conforms with what we would expect overall to see overall in our index.
No. We compiled this index to help undertake some research questions. So we're in the process of using this index in some research to help understand what's happening with economic freedom. What are some of the research questions that we're going to be able to grapple with or address using such an index? And in particular, then, how is that going to represent an improvement over other things that researchers have been trying to do?
One of the things that we set out to do in the specific paper for which we set out to construct the index is look to the extent that you can measure a state's political ideology using essentially the degree to which their state delegation at the national level votes. Looking at the extent to which that ideology can help explain state levels of economic freedom. So something we haven't actually really discussed at length during this program is the idea that we actually have indexes for the different states and the levels of economic freedom in each one of the states. So one of the things that we set out to do in our paper is use this vote index that's a measure at the national level as essentially a proxy for a measure of the state's leanings either towards or against economic freedom, and as an explanatory variable to help explain how the state's economic freedom is determined.
Yeah.
And so why would that, why does that end up being a contribution here? What are we going to be able to get at there in that case that we wouldn't have been able to get at previously?
It's again just attempting to basically put a number or a score to quantitatively get at something that's been elusive to this point. So the idea that a state's political ideology or the direction towards or against economic freedom, that it's the elected officials, the people that are routinely reelected, tend to sway. This is something that's been difficult to get at historically, and what we're really trying to do here is at least control for the extent to which that actually matters.
And I think also then at the state level, one thing that's really nice is that since these are votes on national level issues, they are necessarily separate from the types of policies that maybe state lawmakers would be enacting that could be affecting their state economic freedom, right?
Absolutely, and not to muddy it up too much with the technical details, but that's something that empirical researchers are always really looking for, is something that's essentially that's telling a story but doing it completely separate from the main question you're trying to get at. And since these are necessarily separate national issues trying to get at explaining state level politics, it does that for us nicely.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing, because when you sometimes do have things like, say, a expenditure limit that's imposed on a state, there's always sort of a question of, if you just picked up that same expenditure limit and put it in place in another state, would it have the same effect that it had in the state where it's really helping to help constrain the size of government? And I think our index is one way to try to get better answering some of those questions. So, well, thanks very much for coming on and talk about this, and thank you for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.